40 hooded figures in white circled a lone black woman inside a tobacco barn just outside Greensboro, North Carolina, on the night of October 14th, 1871. They expected terror. They expected pleading. They expected her to run. What none of them expected was a quiet, knowing smile that crossed her face when she identified three of the men by nothing more than the way they carried themselves. The same three former Confederate officers she had watched bleed out in a makeshift field hospital almost 9 years earlier. The men had come to silence the rumors about a woman said to have killed more Southern soldiers than some entire Union companies. Instead, they found someone who had clearly been waiting for them. Local officials buried the incident so thoroughly that, even now, the only surviving record from that night lists a routine agricultural inspection and nothing more. Before we continue the story of the woman who became known as the Greensboro Ghost, if obscure and erased chapters of American history fascinate you, make sure you hit that subscribe button and tell us in the comments what state you're watching from. We always love knowing where our community is listening. The events leading to that October night did not begin in North Carolina at all, but nearly 300 miles to the south, in a place where the truth about the war would later be rewritten to hide a deeply uncomfortable reality. Charleston County, South Carolina, carried a reputation unlike any other, even among the plantation aristocracy. While other regions boasted about cotton yields or the splendor of their estates, Charleston's ruling class whispered about something else entirely: their unnerving talent for breaking the unbreakable. Along the Ashley River, the Tidewater plantations claimed mastery over a grim specialty they called rehabilitation, taking enslaved people considered too violent, too rebellious, or too impossible to manage elsewhere, and reshaping them into obedient laborers. The Hawthorne Plantation, originally established in 1789, was considered the crown jewel of this cruel craft. By 1862, it had passed through several hands and was now owned by Colonel Elias Hawthorne, a man whose notoriety preceded him in every slave market from Richmond to New Orleans. He paid high prices for what others dismissed as hopeless cases: runaways caught over and over again, men and women who had fought overseers, anyone whose spirit he deemed excessive. His ledgers documented an astonishing claim: no successful escape from Hawthorne land in 23 years. The plantation's isolated geography helped. Swamps hemmed it in on three sides, while the Ashley River sealed off the fourth. Two narrow roads served as the only routes in or out, both visible from the widow's walk atop the main house. The young woman who would someday be remembered as the Greensboro Ghost arrived at Hawthorne Plantation on March 3, 1862. The name she carried then is lost, scrubbed from every surviving document, but the bill of sale recorded her as approximately 19 years old, formerly the property of the Beaufort County estate, liquidated. History of violence toward overseers. Sold as is. She had killed a man in Beaufort. Everyone on the auction block knew that story, though no charges had been filed. Enslaved people, after all, could not legally be guilty of murder, only destruction of property. The widow of her previous owner had been desperate to sell her before more damage occurred. Colonel Hawthorne examined her with the cold detachment of a livestock dealer. She was 5'8", remarkably tall for a woman in that era, and her hands carried calluses in odd places, not from cotton work or domestic labor, but from something far stranger. A poorly healed injury gave her left eye a faint, unsettling cast, the kind that made even seasoned overseers shift involuntarily. She did not lower her gaze when white men addressed her. That was her first mistake on Hawthorne property, and the colonel ensured it would be her last for quite some time. The plantation's rehabilitation process followed a rigid method. All new arrivals spent their first month in what was called a training house, a brick structure set apart from the main quarters where Colonel Hawthorne personally supervised the breaking of spirit. No one knew exactly what occurred inside those walls because the people who emerged never spoke of it. They worked. They obeyed. They survived. The young woman from Beaufort entered the training house on March 4th and emerged 31 days later transformed, changed in ways that seemed to satisfy the colonel completely. At first, she was assigned to the field gangs, working the spring planting under the supervision of an overseer named Silas Pitcher. He was known more for his efficiency than for cruelty, which, by plantation standards, meant he used the whip only when he felt it necessary, not as routine encouragement. His reports noted her consistent obedience and an unusual physical endurance. She could work longer than men nearly twice her size, never slowing, never complaining. By midsummer, she was reassigned to skilled labor inside the plantation's small infirmary, and here the record becomes deliberately unclear. Most large plantations maintained a sick house where enslaved people too ill to labor were treated enough to return to the fields. A white physician visited twice a week, but the daily medical work fell to enslaved assistants who showed aptitude. The woman from Beaufort demonstrated a startlingly advanced understanding of anatomy and rudimentary medicine. She set bones cleanly, recognized herbs for treatment, spotted illnesses before symptoms fully developed. When questioned about where she had learned such things, she offered no explanation, not out of resistance, but from something closer to inability, as if her past were a sealed room she refused to enter. Colonel Hawthorne, cruel though he was, understood value when he saw it. By August 1862, she worked almost entirely in the infirmary, her usefulness, and therefore her worth, rising sharply. Hawthorne even provided her with medical texts, carefully chosen ones that taught treatment methods, while limiting literacy to the Latin terms necessary for bodily parts and diseases. She absorbed every page with focus that unsettled the visiting physician, asking questions no uneducated person should have known to ask. Had the war not tightened its grip on the South, the arrangement might have continued unchanged. But by the fall of 1862, the Confederacy's early confidence had curdled into a kind of desperate resolve. Casualties were overwhelming military hospitals, and plantation owners who possessed anything resembling medical facilities found themselves conscripted, sometimes willingly, often not, into treating wounded soldiers. Hawthorne's infirmary was no exception. It was converted into a Confederate field hospital in November of 1862, and the woman from Beaufort suddenly found herself tending to the very men who fought to keep her enslaved. The first wave of soldiers arrived on November 19, 1862. They were casualties from a skirmish near Pocataligo, an event barely acknowledged in the official records. 17 men were brought in, their injuries ranging from minor cuts to wounds that would claim their lives within days. The plantation's infirmary, built to house perhaps 8 people at most, was instantly overcrowded. Dr. Marcus Bellingham, the visiting physician, looked overwhelmed from the moment the wagons creaked up the long dirt road. He was competent enough when treating farm injuries, childbirth complications, fevers, and the usual ailments of rural life. But battlefield medicine was another world entirely. These men arrived with many balls embedded in bone, infections raging through the humid low-country air, wounds open to insects, rot, and contamination. The woman from Beaufort worked through the first 3 days without rest. Dr. Bellingham watched her with increasing uncertainty as she moved from patient to patient with an efficiency that felt impossible for someone in her position. She instinctively knew which wounds required immediate intervention and which men were beyond saving. She extracted bullets with steady, deft hands while soldiers thrashed and screamed. What unsettled Bellingham most was her demeanor, not submissive, not resentful, something else entirely, an expression he later described in a letter to a colleague as a sort of clinical neutrality, as though she were examining animals rather than treating the men fighting for our cause. On the 4th day, a soldier named Private Edwin Vickers began developing symptoms Bellingham initially dismissed as simple infection: high fever, confusion, a racing pulse. He applied standard treatment: willow bark for fever, laudanum for pain, cool cloths to the head. The woman assisting him said nothing, though Vickers noticed her studying him with an expression he couldn't decipher through the delirium. 2 soldiers lying in the beds beside him later reported something unusual. They claimed she adjusted something in his treatment after Bellingham stepped away. Not an obvious act, nothing they could clearly describe, just a swift, subtle movement they almost missed. That night, Private Vickers died. Bellingham performed a quick examination and listed sepsis from the gunshot wound as the cause. The shoulder injury had already begun to turn gangrenous, so no one questioned conclusion. His body was wrapped and carried to the small cemetery behind the main house, where Hawthorne family members were interred in one section and enslaved workers in another. Death was constant in field hospitals. Even under the best conditions, survival rates for serious wounds hovered around 40%. Nothing about Vickers' death stood out. 3 days later, Corporal James Lindsay developed the exact same symptoms. The same treatments were given. The same outcome followed. He died within 18 hours. The woman from Beaufort prepared his body herself, binding him in canvas with practiced precision. By December, 12 of the original 17 soldiers were dead. Dr. Bellingham mentioned the high mortality in his reports to the Confederate Medical Department, but attributed it to the severity of the injuries and inadequate facilities, explanations no official was inclined to question. What he didn't note, and perhaps never realized, was a pattern hidden inside the numbers. The 5 men who survived had minor wounds, injuries that should have healed with or without medical care. The 12 who died included 7 whose wounds, though serious, were not necessarily fatal. 3 were officers. In January 1863, more casualties arrived and the pattern persisted. Hawthorne's infirmary became a revolving door of dying Confederate soldiers. But the mortality rate still didn't raise alarms, because similar statistics were emerging from military hospitals across the South. Infection killed more men than bullets. Disease claimed even more. Nothing at Hawthorne seemed unusual enough to stand out, except, unbeknownst to most, someone was making selections, quietly, methodically, invisibly, a process so gradual that even the men caught in it had no idea. Captain Theodore Winscott arrived in February 1863 with a clean gunshot wound to the leg. The bullet had torn through soft tissue, but missed bone and major arteries. He should have recovered easily. Winscott was different from earlier patients, educated, observant, and once employed as a pharmacist assistant. On his 3rd night in the infirmary, heavily drugged but still conscious, he watched the woman from Beaufort prepare his evening dose of laudanum. Something in her movements made him pay attention. A brief hesitation, a glance over her shoulder, a tiny adjustment to the mixture, an addition from a bottle she kept hidden in her apron rather than from the medicine cabinet. He pretended to swallow the dose, then spat it into his bedding when she turned away. He lay awake for hours afterward, his heart racing, not from fever, but from fear. He had recognized a certain look in her eyes when she handed him the cup. It was the same analytic calm he had seen in his former employer when preparing arsenic powders for vermin. The next morning, his fever had vanished, and he reported feeling considerably better. Dr. Bellingham credited his own treatment plan and the grace of God. Winscott knew better. From that moment on, he watched her closely. He noticed the way she lingered near certain patients while rushing past others. How some men declined rapidly despite treatment, while others with worse injuries stabilized. He noticed the small unlabeled bottles she carried. Tinctures she claimed were herbal remedies approved by Bellingham, though Winscott never once saw the doctor authorize them. On February 28, 1863, Winscott requested a meeting with Colonel Hawthorne to share his suspicions. The colonel listened politely but dismissed the concerns almost immediately. The woman from Beaufort had been obedient since the day she arrived. She had saved numerous soldiers. Had she not earned the doctor's full trust? Captain Winscott, in Hawthorne's eyes, was simply exhausted, frightened, and still healing. Still affected by his wound, the colonel concluded. Perhaps the captain was experiencing the paranoia that so often accompanied fever, blood loss, or laudanum withdrawal. He advised Winscott to rest, recover, and stop burdening himself with suspicions about a mere enslaved woman performing her assigned duties. Winscott eventually recovered fully and was sent back to his regiment in mid-March. Before leaving, he quietly pulled aside 2 other survivors of the Haverton Hospital. Lieutenant Patrick Hornby and Private Calvin Strickland. He told them what he had seen, what he suspected, and urged them to pay close attention to how their treatments were administered. Both men laughed him off. She was just a slave, they said, following Bellingham's orders. The idea that she could be killing Confederate soldiers under everyone's noses was unthinkable. 2 weeks after Winscott's departure, Lieutenant Hornby collapsed and died from sudden cardiac failure. Private Strickland soon developed a creeping paralysis that began in his legs and ascended over 3 days until it stopped his lungs. Dr. Bellingham was baffled, but ultimately blamed some unknown contaminant, spoiled food, bad water, perhaps even tainted medicine. The woman from Beaufort prepared both bodies for burial with quiet efficiency, her expression showing nothing beyond the solemnity expected of her. The spring of 1863 brought rising casualties as the war intensified throughout the Carolinas. Hawthorne Plantation's field hospital expanded rapidly, taking over a converted tobacco barn and the old overseer's cottage. Dr. Bellingham could no longer oversee every case personally and began depending almost entirely on the woman from Beaufort to manage routine care while he focused on the most dire injuries. Colonel Hawthorne, eager to frame his plantation as an essential contributor to Confederate cause, began inviting local officials and military officers to tour the facility. He proudly showcased his trained medical worker as a symbol of enslaved loyalty supporting the war effort. Though he never allowed guests to speak directly with her, she merely demonstrated her skills under his watchful eye. The death toll at Hawthorne's hospital continued rising through the spring and summer, but survival rates at other field hospitals were also fluctuating wildly, making comparisons meaningless. What escaped notice was the nature of the deaths at Hawthorne. Officers died more frequently than enlisted men. Soldiers from wealthy backgrounds died more often than poor farmers. Educated men succumbed at higher rates than the illiterate. The pattern was subtle, easy to dismiss as coincidence unless one was looking for it. No one was. In August 1863, a Union raid disrupted Charleston supply lines, forcing Confederate Army to relocate all Havern Hospital patients to a military facility in Columbia for 6 weeks. The woman from Beaufort remained behind, returning to her previous duties in the regular sick house for enslaved workers. For the first time in months, the dying stopped. Colonel Hawthorne noted increased productivity among his labor force during this period. Fewer illnesses, faster recoveries, no unexplained deaths. Meanwhile, the Columbia Hospital reported no unusual mortality among the transferred soldiers. In fact, several patients who had been declining at Hawthorne improved noticeably after relocation. An Army surgeon, Dr. Nathaniel Grayson, remarked on this in his reports but attributed it to better supplies and more experienced staff. In a private letter, he added that several men mentioned feeling uneasy during their stay at the plantation hospital, though none could explain the feeling beyond the discomfort of being treated by enslaved nurses. When Confederate casualties returned to Hawthorne in October 1863, the pattern resumed almost immediately. The first to die was Major Robert Cunningham, a Georgia plantation owner, who spent his evenings lecturing fellow patients about the absolute necessity of rigid discipline over enslaved populations. He died over the course of 2 excruciating days from what Dr. Bellingham labeled catastrophic organ failure of unknown origin. The woman from Beaufort attended him personally during his final hours, bringing water, adjusting pillows, listening to his rambling fears about uprisings and punishments. In his last moments, as clarity briefly returned, Cunningham recognized something in her eyes, an understanding that filled him with panic. He tried to speak, to warn the others, but his failing tongue refused to form words. He died with that knowledge locked inside him, and she gently closed his eyes without a tremor. By December 1863, the death toll at Hawthorne's Confederate Hospital had reached 87 soldiers, an alarming number, though overshadowed by similarly grim statistics across the South. The Confederate Medical Department was drowning in shortages, overwhelmed by casualties, and lacked the manpower to investigate every failing facility. Nearly every hospital was failing. Men were dying everywhere. It had become a grim normality of the war. What the Confederacy could not have known, what no one could discover without exhuming bodies or performing toxicology tests decades ahead of their time, was her method. Over the course of more than a year, the woman from Beaufort had perfected a system of killing that mimicked natural disease and battlefield complications. Never too sudden, never too obvious, just quiet, deliberate decline. She used combinations of native low-country plants, oleander to sabotage the heart, water hemlock to disrupt the nervous system, pokeweed to induce violent gastrointestinal distress. Each death looked different. Each death looked natural. Even if Bellingham had grown suspicious, he lacked the medical knowledge to recognize plant toxins expertly layered to resemble complications from gangrene, infection, or fever. But the winter of 1863 to 1864 brought a change she had not anticipated. Colonel Hawthorne fell gravely ill, not from poison, but from a liver condition that had plagued him for years and had finally reached its end stage. As he declined through January and February, control of the plantation shifted to his wife, Lady Eleanor Hawthorne, a woman who had always kept her distance from the daily workings of the property. She trusted the systems her husband built, including the infirmary and the woman who effectively ran it. In March 1864, Mrs. Hawthorne's son, Lieutenant Charles Hawthorne, returned home on medical leave with a minor wound to his arm. It should have healed within days. Instead, his fever rose and fell in strange, unpredictable waves that even Dr. Bellingham struggled to explain. The woman from Beaufort tended him personally, preparing special teas she said would bring down inflammation and speed his recovery. Mrs. Hawthorne watched in growing dread as her son weakened. His strong frame withered despite every treatment. On the seventh night, delirious with fever, Charles seized a woman's wrist as she offered him a cup of medicine. His cracked voice rasped, "You're killing me, aren't you?" Just like the others. She didn't speak. She never spoke. But something in her stillness, in her absolute lack of surprise, made Mrs. Hawthorne, seated quietly in the corner, finally see what her late husband had been too proud, too certain to notice. The pattern, the unexplained deaths, the faint, fleeting glimmer of satisfaction she had occasionally glimpsed on the woman's face when select patients drew their final breaths. That night, Mrs. Hawthorne said nothing, but she no longer allowed the woman to treat her son alone. Within days, Charles recovered. For the next 2 weeks, Eleanor Hawthorne locked herself in her husband's old office, poring over years of medical logs. Colonel Hawthorne had kept meticulous records of every patient, names, injuries, treatments, outcomes, and once examined with suspicion rather than deference, the numbers became damning. From November 1862 to March 1864, 143 Confederate soldiers had been treated at Hawthorne Plantation. 94 of them had died, a 65.7% mortality rate. Terrible, but not unheard of during wartime. It wasn't the total number that condemned the plantation. It was a breakdown. Officers, 78% mortality. Enlisted men from wealthy or prominent families, 71%. Educated soldiers, 69%. Poor farmers and laborers, 34%. Once the pattern was visible, it was unmistakable. The woman from Beaufort had been selectively eliminating Confederacy's leadership class, men with social power, influence, and wealth, while allowing conscripts and impoverished soldiers to survive. On March 29, 1864, Mrs. Hawthorne confronted Dr. Bellingham with her findings. At first, he defended his work. Officers, he argued, were often more gravely wounded because they led charges. Wealthy men lacked physical hardiness. Education had no bearing on survival. But as she walked him slowly through specific cases, men with minor injuries who died inexplicably, recovering patients who suddenly collapsed, mysterious illnesses that targeted only certain profiles, his certainty began to erode. They compared his written orders to treatments that had actually been administered. The discrepancies were small, almost invisible. An extra dose of laudanum here, An altered herbal mixture there. Slight changes no one would question from a trusted assistant. Bellingham had relied on her out of wartime necessity, out of exhaustion, out of the assumption, so deeply ingrained, that an enslaved woman could never orchestrate something so covert, so deliberate, so devastating. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had been an unknowing participant in nearly 100 deaths. He wanted to report everything at once, to have her arrested and tried, until Mrs. Hawthorne reminded him of a brutal legal reality. Enslaved people could not, by law, be tried for the murder of white men. Legally, an enslaved person could only damage property. The very system designed to dehumanize her had created the perfect blind spot for her to operate in. Mrs. Hawthorne faced a different crisis. If the truth spread that Hawthorne Plantation had been the site of covert, systematic killings of Confederate soldiers, her family would be ruined, their property seized, their social standing obliterated, her children disgraced. Her rage warred with practicality. Her son had nearly died. 94 soldiers were dead. But exposing the truth would destroy everything the Hawthornes had built over generations. On April 2nd, 1864, she made her decision. The field hospital would close immediately. Remaining patients would be transferred to Columbia. Dr. Bellingham would resign, citing exhaustion. The woman from Beaufort would be sold. Quickly, quietly, and far away, with no mention of her medical knowledge or the deaths at Hawthorne. Records would not be destroyed. That would raise suspicion, but altered subtly, enough to obscure patterns within an already chaotic Confederate bureaucracy. No one would notice. No one would care. Bellingham agreed, though the choice would torture him for the rest of his life. The woman was informed on April 5th that she was being sold. She didn't protest. She packed the few belongings she had and waited beside the road for the trader who would take her away. Mrs. Hawthorne watched from the upstairs window, trying to comprehend what kind of person could kill for so long, so patiently, with such precise restraint. The woman never looked toward the house, never acknowledged the rows of graves, never betrayed emotion. On April 8th, the trader arrived, a man named Jasper Crenshaw, notorious for handling difficult sales. Mrs. Hawthorne told him only that the woman had become unsuitable for plantation work and needed to be sent somewhere with minimal exposure to white people beyond routine supervision. Crenshaw understood immediately. Some enslaved people developed dangerous attitudes, and the safest solution was to send them far away, where their past was unknown. He had a buyer in Tennessee who needed field workers. No questions asked. The sale was completed for $800, a pittance compared to what she would have fetched had her medical training been disclosed. But Mrs. Hawthorne wasn't seeking profit. She wanted her gone. The woman from Beaufort left Hawthorne Plantation on April 10th, 1864, chained in the back of Jasper Crenshaw's wagon. She had been on the property for exactly 25 months and 13 days. In that time, she had killed 94 Confederate soldiers, a fact that would remain buried for 7 more years and then dismissed as fantasy, propaganda, or the irrational ramblings of defeated Southerners searching for scapegoats. As the wagon rattled down the long, oak-lined road away from the Ashley River, she turned once to look back at the cemetery where her victims lay. Some witnesses later swore they saw her smile. The story should have ended there. Mrs. Hawthorne believed it did. Dr. Bellingham desperately hoped so. And Jasper Crenshaw didn't care one way or the other as long as he got paid. None of them understood that the woman they were selling off had spent 16 months doing far more than killing Confederate soldiers. She'd been studying them, memorizing how they fought, how they organized, how they thought. She learned their command structure, their medical vulnerabilities, their bureaucratic blind spots. Hawthorne Plantation had not just been a hospital to her, it had been an academy, and she was its most attentive student. Crenshaw's wagon never reached Tennessee. His body was found on April 18th, 1864, lying in a ravine about 30 miles west of Columbia, South Carolina. His throat had been cut with professional precision. Not the frantic slash of a runaway, but the exacting stroke of someone who knew where to cut to sever the carotid artery cleanly and minimize struggle. The wagon was gone. The horses were gone. The woman he'd been transporting was gone. 3 other enslaved people he had purchased for resale were also missing. A brief Confederate investigation followed, but the Army had far larger problems. Sherman's forces were advancing, and one dead slave trader scarcely justified meaningful attention. What happened next survives only in scattered fragments, contradicting reports, ambiguous witness statements, and suspicious gaps in a historical record that suggests intentional erasure. Between April 1864 and April 1865, Confederate military documents from Georgia and the Carolinas include references to peculiar casualties, deaths not attributable to Union action, soldiers found dead at their posts without wounds, small patrols that vanished without trace, officers who died in their sleep inside secure camps. The numbers were never high enough to cause panic. 2 men here, 5 there, a dozen gone in what was assumed to be a Union raid that somehow left no footprints. Confederate intelligence officers noticed irregularities, but blamed deserters, bandits, or unusually skilled Union scouts. No one considered the possibility that a trained killer could move through Confederate camps precisely because she did not match the profile of a threat. An escaped enslaved woman traveling alone would draw suspicion. Yes, she would be detained or killed. But a black woman carrying forged papers identify her as a free nurse displaced by the war, someone offering medical assistance that the Confederacy desperately needed. Commanders overlooked inconsistencies. They were drowning in casualties. A competent medic was a gift from heaven. In September 1864, Major Theodore Winscott, the former pharmacist assistant who had survived Hawthorne Plantation, encountered her again near Atlanta. He had risen in rank and was overseeing a supply depot supporting Confederate forces retreating from Sherman's advance. A black woman arrived claiming to be a nurse from Montgomery, with forged papers identifying her as a free woman named Sarah Bridgewell. The documentation was good enough to pass amid the chaos of retreat. Winscott recognized her instantly. Her height, the faint misalignment in her left eye, the precise economy in every movement. He approached cautiously, not accusing her, only observing. She did not acknowledge him. She played her role perfectly, tending to wounded soldiers with quiet professionalism. But when Winscott mentioned Hawthorne Plantation, mentioned the pattern of deaths, mentioned Lieutenant Hornby and Private Strickland, who had died soon after ignoring his warnings, something flickered across her face. Not fear, not remorse, recognition. "You know what I am," she murmured. Her first direct words to him. Her voice was refined, educated, nothing like the silence she had maintained at Hawthorne. "You know what I've done. The question is, what will you do about it?" Winscott felt trapped between 2 nightmares. If he exposed her, she would be executed. But not before Confederate leaders learned she had murdered nearly 100 soldiers at Hawthorne. That knowledge could devastate morale, unravel trust in enslaved medical workers, and cripple the Confederacy's already fragile hospital system. But if he did nothing, she would continue killing. He arrested her. Officially, at least, she was detained by military police and held in a poorly secured warehouse while he contacted the provost marshal. But the guards were inexperienced recruits far more worried about Sherman's advance than one unarmed woman. By morning, she was gone. So was the sergeant assigned to guard her. His body was found 2 days later in a burned-out house. The report claimed he died in the fire, though markings on his neck suggested he had been strangled before the flames consumed the building. Major Winscott filed a report stating she had escaped. He omitted Hawthorne. He omitted everything else. He told himself he was protecting Confederate morale. In his private journal, discovered after his death in 1889, he confessed the truth. He let her go. When he looked into her eyes at the depot, he saw something that chilled him more than Sherman's army. A calm, unwavering certainty that the Confederacy would fall, and that she would help hasten its collapse one officer at a time. Trying to stop her, he wrote, would only make her more careful. Through the fall and winter of 1864, the reports continued, a field their throats when they saw her standing there, calm and motionless in the doorway. A field hospital in Augusta had lost 6 patients to unexplained organ failure. A Confederate encampment near Wilmington reported contaminated water that supposedly killed 11 men. Yet investigations found no contamination at all, only corpses with no identifiable cause of death. In Richmond, a military physician wrote to the Surgeon General warning of a troubling pattern. Unfamiliar black medical workers appearing at hospitals, demonstrating remarkable skill for a few days, then vanishing before anyone could verify their paperwork. He was told to stop worrying about administrative trivia when soldiers were dying by the hundreds. The war ended in April 1865 with Lee's surrender at Appomattox. The Confederate medical system collapsed into chaos. Its record was scattered, burned, or lost entirely. Any attempt to trace unusual casualty patterns was impossible. There was no longer an institution capable of investigating anything. And in that chaos, the woman from Hawthorne Plantation, who had killed at least 94 soldiers there, and an unknown number afterward, simply disappeared. For 6 years, not a hint of her surfaced. Then in October 1871, rumors spread from a rural stretch outside Greensboro, North Carolina. A black woman had purchased a small property on the outskirts of town, an astonishing feat for someone with no visible income or family support. She was described as tall, quiet, self-contained, with a distinct cast in her left eye. She kept entirely to herself. Local white residents found her unsettling. They could never explain why. She caused no trouble, broke no laws, and committed no offense other than existing independently in a world that insisted she shouldn't. Occasionally, Confederate veterans passing through recognized her or believed they did. A former lieutenant named William Hastings swore she was a nurse who attended him at a South Carolina field hospital, the one whose medicine had nearly killed him until he refused to take more. A former captain, David Merrick, claimed she had been at a Georgia hospital where half the patients died from unexplained complications. Their accounts were dismissed as delusions of embittered men struggling to rationalize the Confederacy's ruin. But the newly formed Ku Klux Klan took interest in the woman not because of any crime she committed, but because her existence offended their worldview. A black woman owning land, living alone, carrying herself with a confidence that suggested she feared no one, unacceptable. They decided she needed to be made an example of. They had no idea who they were dealing with. No idea she had killed more Confederate soldiers than some Union regiments. No idea she had spent the last 6 years not hiding, not fleeing, but waiting for the moment the men who once fought to keep her enslaved would come for her again. She intended to finish what she had begun at Hawthorne Plantation. Just when the story seems to settle, the darkness in Greensboro deepens. If this tale is sending chills down your spine, share it with someone who loves sinister mysteries. Hit that like button to support our work, and subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Now, let's step into what happened next. The Klan's plan was simple, polished through dozens of terror raids across the rebuilding South. 40 men, large enough for overwhelming force, small enough to travel unnoticed, would surround the property, burn the woman out her house, and inflict whatever punishment they deemed appropriate. Most such raids ended with beatings, some with lynchings, sometimes with rape. The details didn't matter. The message did. Black independence would not be tolerated. They chose October 14th, 1871 deliberately, a Saturday night, so the shattered remnant of the black community would find the aftermath on their way to church the next morning. At 10 p.m., 40 robed men assembled at a nearby farm 3 miles from the property. They wore white hoods, carried torches and rifles, and rode with the smug confidence of men who had never faced real resistance in their raids. Many were former Confederate soldiers, men who returned home to a world they barely recognized. Enslaved people freed, Union troops occupying cities, black men voting. Their raids gave them back a sense of control, a twisted restoration of the power they felt slipping away. At 11:30, they surrounded her land. They positioned themselves at every exit. Her house was a small wooden structure, one story, 2 rooms visible from outside. A tiny barn stood behind it, barely big enough for a cart. Not the tobacco barn later misreported in newspapers. A single lamp glowed in the window. She was awake. The Klan leader, a former Confederate colonel named Benjamin Pritchard, raised his hand. Torches flared. The men advanced. The door opened before they reached it. She stepped into the frame, silhouetted by lamplight, unarmed, alone, wearing a simple cotton dress. She didn't scream, didn't flinch. She watched them with the same cold, clinical assessment she had used at Hawthorne Plantation, an expression that made several of the men uneasy, as though they were the ones being examined, prodded, measured for slaughter. "Evening," she said, her voice level and composed. "I wonder when you'd come." Pritchard puffed up his chest, eager to reassert dominance. "You're coming with us," he barked. "Time you learn what happens to uppity," he spat a slur, "who forget their place." "Am I?" she replied, tilting her head slightly. And that was the moment 3 men in white robes froze where they stood. Captain Andrew Sewell had been treated at a Confederate hospital in Augusta, the one that lost 6 men to mysterious organ failure. Lieutenant Marcus Peyton had survived Hawthorne Plantation and never forgotten the nurse whose presence unsettled him. Former Major William Hastings had spent 6 years trying to tell people what he'd seen, only to be dismissed as unstable. All 3 recognized her instantly. All 3 understood, too late, what was about to happen. They tried to speak, tried to warn Pritchard, tried to turn back, but the words caught their throats because what they needed to confess felt too impossible to speak aloud. This lone, unarmed woman, the one they had expected to terrify into submission, was, in truth, the most dangerous person any of them had ever encountered. "You boys really should have done your research," she continued, stepping down from the porch with deliberate, unhurried precision. "Should have asked around about who lived here before you decided to pay a visit." Pritchard raised his rifle. "Shut your..." She moved. Even the men who were watching couldn't later describe how she moved. Only that one moment she stood on the porch, and the next she had jerked Pritchard's rifle from his hands, reversed it, and smashed the stock into his face with enough force to shatter bone and drop him like a stone. 2 men rushed her. She swept the first man's legs out with the rifle's barrel, sending him crashing onto his back, then pivoted smoothly and drove but into the second man's solar plexus with precise anatomical intent, collapsing his diaphragm and leaving him gasping on the ground. The remaining 37 Klansmen froze for perhaps 3 seconds, long enough for her to slip back inside the house, slam the door bar in place, and latch the window shutters. Someone finally fired, and bullets ripped through the wooden walls, but she had already moved to a location they couldn't predict. Return fire answered from a north window. A Klansman named Robert Turnbull screamed as a bullet shattered his kneecap. "She's armed!" someone shouted, an obvious remark, but panic made men say obvious things. More gunfire erupted from different windows, east and south, then north again. It dawned on them that she had multiple rifles already staged throughout the house, each one loaded in position for defensive fire. This woman hadn't been surprised. She had been waiting for them. Former Major Hastings finally found his voice. "It's her," he yelled. "From Hawthorne. She killed nearly 100 of our men during the war." "She's one woman," someone shouted back. 37 now. Her voice echoed from inside the house. Cool, sharp, deliberate. Pritchard's unconscious. Turnbull's bleeding out. He'll lose the leg if he doesn't get help soon. That leaves 37 of you against someone who's been killing Confederate soldiers for a decade. How many of you want to be next? They should have rushed the house right then, with sheer numbers overwhelming any advantage she had. But the memory of how she moved, the precision of her strikes, the unmistakable lack of fear in her voice, those things carved a psychological wall through them. Suddenly 40 Klansmen were not an organized paramilitary force, but a frightened crowd grasping for consensus. Some wanted to retreat. Others wanted to burn the house. A few demanded negotiation. The Klan had always thrived on terrorizing the defenseless. This woman was not defenseless. The standoff stretched into 4 long hours. During that time, she shot 7 more men who exposed themselves while searching for better positions. Not fatal shots, knees, shoulders, hands. Disabling wounds delivered with surgical precision. It was deliberate restraint, a kind of mercy that felt far more unnerving than outright slaughter. She could have killed them all. She chose not to, and somehow that terrified them more. Around 3 a.m., one of the men torched the barn behind the house, hoping the flames would force her out or at least light the yard. The barn ignited instantly, dry wood and old hay making a perfect accelerant. In the orange glow, the Klansmen finally saw their losses clearly. 11 men badly wounded. Pritchard still unconscious. Turnbull dead from blood lost despite attempted tourniquets. What was supposed to be a routine terror raid had become a disastrous military engagement, and they were losing. Lieutenant Peyton, who had at last remembered why she unsettled him so deeply at Hawthorne, made a decision. He stood up, raised his hands, and stepped into the open. "We're leaving," he called toward the house. "We're taking our wounded. We won't be back." Silence. Then her voice. "How do I know you'll keep that promise?" "Because you could have killed us all by now," Peyton replied. "And you didn't, because I know what you did during the war and who you chose. Officers, planters, men who owned slaves, men who profited from this world. You let the conscripts go home. We're going home now, all of us who are left." Another moment of silence. Then the front door opened. She stepped out, rifle in hand but lowered. She scanned the remaining men, her gaze lingering on familiar faces from hospital tents years earlier. "I counted," she said softly. "Counted every Confederate soldier I killed. 187 at Hawthorne and after, plus 23 tonight would make 210. But you only killed 187, someone shouted weakly. She smiled, the kind of smile that made even the bravest men recoil. "I'm rounding up for psychological impact," she said. "The exact number matters less than the message. There are consequences for what you did, and I was those consequences. Go home." They did. The Klansmen dragged their wounded, lifted Pritchard's limp body, strapped Turnbull's corpse to a horse, and fled into the night. She watched their retreating silhouettes until final hoofbeats faded into the darkness. Then she re-entered her house and began removing every trace of the fight. By sunrise, the burned barn was the only visible sign anything had happened. The bodies from her war years lay buried too deep, too scattered, to ever be uncovered. The Klansmen who survived told stories, but without evidence. Stories were just stories. The official record for October 14th, 1871, lists only routine property inspection. Greensboro, North Carolina. No Klan raid. No standoff. No injuries. No deaths. Benjamin Pritchard claimed his shattered face came from a fall off his horse. Turnbull's death was blamed on complications from an old war wound. The 7 injured men invented their own explanations, each plausible enough to avoid scrutiny. But silence cracks. Eventually, it always cracks. The tale began to leak, quietly at first, ended up convincing some readers that the story had struck closer to the truth than the veterans intended. The more fiercely an institution denies something, the more people wonder why. For years after the Greensboro incident, the whispers continued, passed quietly among aging Confederate veterans in smoky backrooms where men gathered to retell the war in ways that made themselves feel braver, stronger, or more important than they had ever been. Every now and then, after enough whiskey loosened tongues, someone from that raid would let something slip. The way she moved, too fast for the eye to follow. The impossible precision with which she fired. The eerie calm in her voice as she counted them one by one. Another veteran might mention a memory from the war, a tall black nurse who tended soldiers with unnerving skill. patients under her care who died at rates no one could explain. Individually, the stories meant nothing, but over months and years, the fragments began to align into a pattern in the collective memory of men who thought they had survived the Civil War, only to realize that perhaps they hadn't escaped it at all. Former Major Wayne Winscott heard these murmurs throughout the 1870s. By 1872, his journal contained 17 separate accounts from different veterans who claimed to have encountered the same woman at various Confederate medical facilities between 1862 and 1865. The descriptions were too consistent to dismiss. Her height, the slight cast in her left eye, her unsettling competence, the suspicious surge in fatal outcomes wherever she worked. The former major began an informal investigation. He wrote to surviving Confederate medical officers, gathered sparse hospital records that had survived the collapse of the Confederacy, and compared them to witness accounts. What he uncovered disturbed him more than he expected. The remaining Confederate casualty logs, fragmented, scattered, incomplete, contained glaring anomalies in multiple locations where the woman had been spotted. A field hospital in Augusta, which typically recorded about a 40% mortality rate, suddenly spiked to 73% during a 3-week period in late 1864. The death rate returned to normal immediately after a black medical worker left under unclear circumstances. A facility in Wilmington reported losing 19 patients in 5 days to what was described as an epidemic illness, yet no other regional hospitals experienced anything similar. The most damning correlation came when Winscott cross-referenced dates of sightings with officer-level deaths. Wherever she appeared, lieutenant-level and above casualties rose by 42%. He never published his findings. The implications were too destructive for a South desperately rewriting itself into the comforting mythology of the lost cause. To admit that a single enslaved woman had quietly executed hundreds of Confederate soldiers, many of them elite officers, through the very medical care they trusted would shatter the romantic fantasies of loyal slaves and noble warfare. So Wayne Winscott kept his research private, continuing it obsessively until his death in 1889. When his family sorted through his belongings, they found dozens of notebooks filled with charts, letters, calculations, and anguished attempts to reconcile what he had witnessed and his own role in enabling it. The woman herself remained on her Greensboro property for 3 more years after standoff. Her presence became increasingly untenable, not because anyone dared confront her again, but because her existence alone challenged white supremacy in a way local authorities could not tolerate indefinitely. Officials began inventing bureaucratic justifications to harass her, disputed boundary lines, questions about whether her deed had been properly filed, whispered accusations that a woman living alone might be engaged in immoral behavior. Yet none of these manufactured concerns escalated into direct action. Everyone remembered what had happened to the last white men who tried to intimidate her. In the spring of 1874, 3 black community leaders visited her home. They were men who had gained modest influence during Reconstruction, a preacher, a schoolteacher, and a shop owner who had managed to purchase his business. They came with a plea: leave North Carolina willingly while she still could. The political winds were shifting. Federal troops were withdrawing. Reconstruction protections were collapsing. White supremacist militias were regaining control through violence and intimidation, and her presence, her survival, was becoming a rallying point for white resentment that endangered the entire black community. She listened silently as they presented their case. When they finished, she asked only one question: how many of you were slaves? All 3 raised their hands. Then you understand why I did what I did, she said. They nodded. We do, the minister answered. But your war is over. Ours is just beginning, and it is a different kind of war. A war for survival, not revenge. Your presence here makes that survival harder. 2 weeks later, she sold her property to a white farmer for far less than its value, packed her belongings, and left Greensboro in May 1874. After that, her trail splintered into conflicting accounts. A woman matching her description appeared in Philadelphia later that year, working as a midwife under the name Sarah Bridgewell, the same alias she used during the war. Another report placed someone similar in Chicago's growing South Side, running an informal clinic for freedmen who couldn't afford white doctors. A third, less credible account claimed she had traveled to Liberia with a group of formerly enslaved people seeking a symbolic return to Africa. What's certain is that she vanished from official records entirely. Unlike many figures of the Civil War era who appear in census rolls, city directories, or death certificates, no definitive trace of her remained. That absence itself is revealing. It suggests someone who had mastered the art of disappearing, of living in the spaces between documentation, in the blind spots institutions never think to examine. The institutional reaction to her legend showed how profoundly she threatened established narratives. When Northern papers occasionally ran sensationalized accounts of the Greensboro Ghost in the 1880s, usually framed as tall tales told by defeated Southerners, Confederate veterans organizations issued formal rebuttals. The United Confederate Veterans, founded in 1889, specifically addressed what they called the Greensboro Ghost myth in their 1891 annual proceedings, dismissing it as Union propaganda meant to disgrace the Confederate medical department. Their denial was so vehement, so specific, so obsessed with refuting particular claims, that it inadvertently confirmed much of what they were trying so desperately to deny. Sometimes, the harder an institution pushes back against a story, the more obvious it becomes that the story carries a dangerous grain of truth. After Dr. Marcus Bellingham died in 1883, his widow discovered his private papers and faced an awful dilemma. His notes detailed everything he had realized far too late about the deaths at Hawthorne Plantation. The patterns, the methods, the subtle manipulation, and his own failure to see what was happening under his nose. Publishing them would clear his conscience in death, but it would also destroy his professional reputation and potentially expose the Hawthorne family to allegations akin to war crimes. She chose silence. The papers were locked in a trunk, passed quietly through 3 generations, and ultimately donated to a historical society in 1947. By then, the events described seemed so distant and improbable that historians initially dismissed them as fabrications or as the writings of a man suffering from post-war trauma. Eleanor Hawthorne took her secrets with her when she died in 1879, but her son Charles lived until 1903, and his surviving correspondence offers glimmers of what truly happened. In an 1897 letter to a cousin, he wrote, "Mother protected our family name by concealing events that would have destroyed us if known. I nearly died by inches in our own home, saved only by her vigilance. The woman responsible walked free, because exposing her would have required admitting what she had done to hundreds of our soldiers. Sometimes I wonder if letting her live wasn't the crueler punishment, forcing her to carry that weight for decades." The Greensboro property changed owners 6 times between 1874 and 1900, and each new resident reported the same unsettling sensation. Nothing tangible, no haunting, no disturbances, just an oppressive sense that something monumental had happened there, something that lingered beneath the surface like a bruise on the land itself. The small shed that burned in 1871 was never rebuilt. Neighbors claimed the ground refused to grow grass, though soil tests would have shown nothing unusual. It was not the earth that was damaged, but the memory of what had unfolded there. Recent scholarship has begun re-examining the evidence with seriousness earlier historians refused to grant it. A 2003 doctoral dissertation analyzed surviving Confederate medical records and identified statistical anomalies consistent with deliberate poisoning across several facilities between 1862 and 1865. A 2015 book on Black resistance during the Civil War devoted an entire chapter to the Greensboro Ghost, concluding that while exact numbers were impossible to verify, substantial evidence indicated that a Black medical worker had indeed killed Confederate soldiers intentionally over an extended period. Whether she killed 50 or 200, the act itself represented a form of resistance that earlier historians dismissed as impossible because accepting it required confronting uncomfortable truths about slavery, agency, and vengeance. What remains indisputable is this: Someone existed who terrified Confederate veterans enough that they spent decades trying to bury her story. Someone skillful enough in medicine and murder to kill without detection. Someone patient enough to maintain a lethal charade for years. Someone who survived not only the war, but also the violent resurgence of white supremacy that followed it. Whether remembered as a Greensboro ghost, the Hawthorne Angel, or simply as one unnamed woman among millions whose stories were never fully recorded, she demonstrated something profound. Even the most oppressive systems contain weaknesses that a determined individual can exploit. The final known reference to her appears in a 1901 letter from a Philadelphia physician to a colleague. He described consulting with an elderly black woman on a complicated medical case. She possessed knowledge that exceeded my own, he wrote. When I asked where she had trained, she smiled in a way that unsettled me deeply and said only, "The war taught me everything I needed to know." I did not press further. If this was indeed the same woman, she would have been in her late 50s, still practicing medicine, still surviving entirely on her own terms more than 30 years after the confrontation that should have ended her life. This mystery reveals how easily history erases truths that threaten comfortable narratives, and how acts of resistance can be dismissed as fantasy even when multiple sources quietly confirm them. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything has been uncovered? Or are there deeper truths still lurking in the gaps of the official record? Leave your thoughts below. And if this tale left you wanting more dark stories rooted in forgotten history, be sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share it with someone who loves mysteries. The past isn't always what we've been told. And sometimes the most terrifying stories are the ones that truly happened.